Senator from Delaware.
I ask unanimous consent to initiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, the bill before us today, the Great American Outdoor Act, is a landmark legislation. It would fulfill a long-standing promise to the American people to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The measure will also make a down payment on deferred maintenance. I'm out of practice here, ma'am. The measure would also make a down payment on deferred maintenance of our nation's beloved public lands. That includes over 400 national parks. It also includes more than 500 national wildlife refuges that are under the jurisdiction of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, on which I serve as ranking member. And while I am proud to support the Great American Outdoors Act, we would be remiss if we did not put the Senate's consideration of this legislation in the context of everything else that's happening in our country today. As we've learned in the 15 days since the death of George Floyd, we also have other long-standing promises to fulfill. Let me mention 4 of them. First is the promise of an end to racial violence in this country and a new beginning in pursuit of racial justice. The second would be the promise of equality. The third would be the promise of a more perfect union called for in our Constitution preamble. The fourth and last would be the promise of a dream articulated nearly 57 years ago on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, not far from where we're gathered here today, by the late Martin Luther King. Our national and state parks, Madam President, have always been places that bring people from all backgrounds together. Our national historical sites and monuments commemorate the events that have forged and tested us as a nation, as well as the sacrifices that we have made in our quest to become that more perfect union. They are also places from which our people have called on their government, our government, for change and for equality. Yes, our national parks have served as places of protest, protected under the Constitution that Delaware was the first state to ratify on December 7th, 1787. In fact, Delaware's national park, one of the newest in the nation, was created in large part to celebrate that history. The recent murders of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor in Louisville have sparked, as we know, widespread civil unrest. And from coast to coast, millions of Americans have come together to protest the death of unarmed Black Americans and call for change, to call for justice, to call for racial equality. In Washington, D.C., some of those demonstrations have taken place in our national park system. Lafayette Square, the site of gassing and the troubling use of crowd dispersion devices last week in response to a peaceful demonstration, has seen its share of protests and turmoil. In its history before the marble monuments it now contains, the square served as a slave market, and it housed troops during the War of 1812 when the White House and the U.S. Capitol, its capital, were burned. Today, and nearly every day, people are gathered in Lafayette Square in front of the White House. They're there to call for action as we debate the bill before us. But in January and February of 1917, women staged 2 months of protest out of a row house located on Lafayette Square in the pursuit of women's suffrage, the right to vote, one of our most sacred privileges. Other national park sites in Washington have been front and center of the call for racial justice in the last several days. The National Mall, the Lincoln Memorial, and one of our newest national historic sites, the memorial to Dr. Martin Luther King, who taught our country about the power of peaceful protests. Madam President, these places inspire us. They allow our voices to be heard. But they also give us strength. They give us solace, and they give us the opportunity to heal. The bill before us today helps us to ensure that our public lands remain places where we can remember, where we can reflect, and we can recharge. Sometimes when I speak on the Senate floor, I share anecdotes from my morning runs. A number of them over the years have been on the National Mall as I run from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial and then past the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, etched with the names of over 58,000 men and women with whom I served in Southeast Asia. No matter how tired I might be when I get up in the morning, when I begin those runs, as I pass and pause at each of these places, I feel inspired, I feel rejuvenated, and I feel more determined than ever to take up our work in service to the American people who sent us here. Interestingly, I've heard a similar sentiment from the hundreds of Delawareans who've asked me to support this legislation before us today. Many of our parks provide visitors a place to reflect, to reconnect, and to enjoy the beauties of nature. That is in no small part because of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Many of our colleagues know that Delaware has a proud history as the first state national historic park, which we worked for a decade to create not long ago, tells the story of the role Delaware played in the establishment of our country. Our national park is unique, with historical sites in all three of Delaware's counties that connect our communities, much like our state parks do. What you may not know, though, is that the first land acquisition through the state side of the Land and Water Conservation Program in this country occurred in Delaware. Brandywine Creek State Park, located just north of Wilmington, Delaware, my hometown, was established in 1965. At the time of this monumental acquisition, there was not much of a state park system in Delaware, certainly not in Newcastle County, our northernmost county. Since that time, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has enabled the purchase and development of many additional state parks that are crown jewels in all three counties of the first state. I'll mention a few of them. White Clay Creek, Cape Henlopen, Fox Point, Bellevue, Killen's Pond, and many more. For us in Delaware, these spaces are places of community. People from all walks of life come to these parks for many reasons, for many different reasons. Some come to fish, others to bike, others to hike, play sports, fly kites, swim, go birding, learn, enjoy picnics, and enjoy concerts. Those are just some of the reasons why people come to our national parks. Not just from Delaware, not just from America, but from all over the world. Some of the parks I've just mentioned might exist without the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But without it, they would not be the community cornerstones that they are today. When a park is revitalized, it can become the nerve center of a community and create new opportunities to bring us together. In many cases, we have seen just that happen in our state. For example, Bellevue State Park, located not far from our home, has been home to a community garden program for decades, providing a place for families like my own when our sons were young, who may not have a lot of land on which to grow their own fruits and vegetables. In 2017, just 3 years ago, the city of Wilmington was awarded an LWCF grant to improve Father Tucker Park, which had been in disrepair for decades. The park is vital for play, for cultural gatherings and sports activities. It's now a valuable hub of that community. Further, the Land and Water Conservation Fund enabled the first public pool in Kent County at the Killen's Pond State Park, just about 10 miles south of Dover. It's now the Killen's Pond Water Park, and it's grown quite popular with residents from across Kent County and well beyond Kent County's borders. So, Madam President, this legislation also helps us to bring economic activity to our community, something that people might not think of at first blush. In Delaware, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has enabled an incredible network of greenways and trails that connect community facilities and institutions with businesses. People come from all over the country to ride, to run, and to walk on them. Basic investment in preservation of land, investments in paths and trails is a tangible community-building enterprise. People can get on their bicycle in downtown Wilmington, ride through the city and out into the suburbs and to the Delaware River at Fox Point State Park, just 3 miles from our home. These paths are more than, and I might add, there's another one too. You can, from the train station where I got the train this morning to come down here, there's a Jack Markell trail that links the riverfront in Wilmington, Delaware to Newcastle, Delaware, where Ben Franklin first landed and brought with him the deeds to Delaware and Pennsylvania. But those paths that I just mentioned expand horizons, they connect people to each other, and they create common ground in our communities. The Delaware State Parks Youth Conservation Corps even provides jobs and environmental restoration opportunities throughout our parks for young people from all backgrounds. What's more, our Delaware State Parks offer free summer concerts. These concert series attract different genres and diverse audiences. While the 2020 Summer Concert Series was unfortunately canceled due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, Delaware State Parks have remained open. And get this, our state has waived entrance fees. As it became clear that physical location was key to preventing the spread of novel coronavirus, Delawareans, especially those in urban areas, sought solitude in our parks. For many, connecting with nature was critical for mental wellness, and now making that connection has grown more popular than ever. One example of that is Brandywine Creek State Park. Located just a few miles south of our border with Pennsylvania, it has seen record visitation this year. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, I have heard from hundreds of constituents in support of the American Outdoors Act. Many of them have shared stories about their treasured moments in state and national parks, particularly during troubled times. I want to close my remarks today by sharing one of those stories. It's from a woman friend, as it turns out, the executive director of Delaware Wildlands, and her name is Kate Hackett. About a year and a half ago, Kate, along with her family and another family, traveled to a place called Big Bend National Park in the state of Texas. This park is on the U.S.-Mexican border, as some of you know. These two families were distressed by what was happening along our borders. They wanted to visit border towns to experience their humanity themselves. As the two families hiked along the Rio Grande River, Kate's friend sang her favorite lullaby, not in English, but in Spanish. Her song echoed in the canyon, and when she paused, an unknown voice from across the border emerged with the next verse of the same song. These two strangers, divided by the depths of a canyon, alternated verses, savoring a shared experience, regardless of borders, regardless of race, regardless of languages. I was moved at the time to hear how Kate was able to use her family's outdoor experience that day. I'm still moved today. And to hear about how that day taught her children a lesson in compassion, a lesson in humanity, and a lesson in acceptance of us all. As the soul of our nation continues to be tested, I hope the legislation before us, the Great American Outdoors Act, might somehow provide similar opportunities for others. In fact, I challenge all of us to make sure that it does just that. And most importantly, I also sincerely hope that we'll soon fulfill at least two other long-standing promises for equality and justice that are critical for the future of this country and our democracy. Our public lands can be part of a greater multifaceted solution that brings equity and opportunity to all of our communities from sea to shining sea. In the midst of all the turmoil we face in America today lies opportunity. It's our job to find that opportunity and to work together to move this country, which we love and revere, as imperfect as we are, forward. That is our challenge, and that is our opportunity. Madam President, I don't know a lot of Latin, but I do know 2 words, maybe a few more. My 2 favorites are these: carpe diem. Carpe diem, seize the day. And this week, we have the opportunity on this floor to seize the day. And Madam President, right over your head where you're sitting are some other Latin words: e pluribus unum, from many one. That's what this country's all about. And I think this legislation, maybe not something we would have thought of, can actually help make those words, not just words, Latin words carved in stone, but a reality. From many one. And with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.